Boom, what up? Today we're going to be doing the ultimate World of Warcraft retrospective. I did one of these sort of looking back on how each of the main raid tiers of Dragonflight went, and now that we're done with the first raid tier of Nerebar Palace, we're going to do a bigger one. And the reason why we're doing a bigger one is that I'm probably not going to play World of Warcraft anymore. So we're going to talk about how that came to be, what we're going to be doing next, and some sort of conclusive thoughts to take away from the whole experiment. As always, let's start with the motivation for why we do this kind of thing. I think it's good to intermittently, concretely state your goals and beliefs about the world. If you say, at some fixed point in time, I think this thing is true, I think that thing is true, I don't think this other thing is true, I disagree with people about X, I agree with people about Y, I want to do Z, then you have a real benchmark against which you can come back and compare later. You can see, at this point in time, I really concretely believe these things. Concretely stating them forced me to come up with what I actually believe rather than sort of having half-formed thoughts in your head. And maybe in the process of writing those things down, you are able to evolve your beliefs a little bit, improve them, realize where there's sort of gaps or mistakes, change your mind a little bit. And then a few months later, you can come back and see like, hey, I actually changed my mind in a lot of ways. Or, in this arena, I actually didn't change my mind that much. And, maybe there's some introspection or improvement to be done there when you realize, how you've changed as a person from some prior mark. In addition, I think if you think that it's worth spending a lot of time to do anything, then it's probably worth spending a little bit of time to reflect on how that thing is going. So, if you work a job for 40 hours a week, you should probably spend like an hour a week thinking about how that job is going or how you could do it better, or if you're happy with how it's going or your performance or things like that. And if you're going to spend 4 hours a day playing World of Warcraft, you should probably spend, 10 minutes a day or something reflecting on why you're doing it and how you could be doing it better, and if it's, serving your goals as best as it can. So that's why we do this video. And then the sort of background for me as a player. I played for 3 months Legion. I did 3 weeks of Nighthold and got to 2 out of 8 or 3 out of 8 Mythic, and then quit the game for like 7 years. I came back something like the last week of July in 2022 to start playing in Shadowlands Season 4. And in Dragonflight, I went from World Rank 2000 in Vault of the Incarnates to something like 250 in Abyss to something like 150 in Immortal. And then this last tier I rated with GN of Mal'Ganis on NA, and we finished rank 27 overall. So this was my sort of fourth and last season of real Mythic progression. So let's talk about some game stuff. I've normally split this out as, keys versus raid, as, Mythic Plus used to be more important for me. But now this is like keys and general preparation. I don't have a lot to say here because I think it was pretty ho-hum. Dungeons this season were just really quite easy, even from the start. There was never any question about like being able to fill your vault week 1 or get the items that you needed at the appropriate item level. Mythic Plus gear was just like relatively bad this tier, so I think I was done with keys by like Friday of the first week or something, without even playing as much as I had in past seasons. One thing we did a little differently this tier, as opposed to previous ones, was we ran 3 splits, whereas in the past I've only done 2. And these were 3 real splits where we expected to, split the end boss on heroic, as opposed to, in Immortal we did 2 splits, but sort of merged the splits after Smolderon. So you weren't really doing difficult heroic content week 1 on your alt. And this was the start of an expansion where you had to like level up 3 dudes and do the sort of like rep grind and PvP gearing process. I think this mostly went fine. I think I had reasonable estimations on sort of how long certain things would take, and committing the minimal amount of time to really sort of boring, non-important optimizations at the start. Like I think it was possible to be really degenerate and get another 0.1 item levels that didn't really change the result of heroic splits at all, and I mostly sort of dodged all of that nonsense and did did things pretty efficiently while still, keeping my actual gameplay down to a minimum. Um, there's some stuff like you could do, like PvP gearing was pretty important. I farmed a lot of conquest by AFKing in epic battlegrounds while I went to the gym or took a shower, and like I don't know, that probably saved me 10 hours of having to actually like do PvP, which is pretty sick. What went poorly? Like again, not much can go poorly when it's just not that relevant for your main raid progression. I played pretty fast and loose in the first week keys, and maybe the thing that affected or that this impacted was that it made people in my guild hate me because I'm chain dying or missing kicks or something. I think over time my sort of level of focus between raid content, like real raid progression content, and the rest of the game has diverged pretty sharply, where like I'm able to focus for raid and especially for progression rating, and then everything else I just like kind of zone out and sort of just like play on instinct rather than actually thinking about what I'm doing or planning my actions in any way, which would be pretty bad if I were like still trying to get much better at the game, but for now it's not been too consequential. So let's talk about raid. First 4 bosses, these are just a joke. They were all really easy. Only Rashdon took like more than 5 pulls, and it was mostly just like people learning what one mechanic did, and then you killed the fight or something. It was really quite boring. Brood Twister was a real boss. I think one thing that was pretty tough for me on this boss was that I actually felt much more affected as a player by the lag than I would have expected. Like our first night of progression, it was just like horrible. Every time the ads spawn, your game would lock up, and that distracted me in kind of a inexcusable way, where like I would miss a kick or like die to something because I was frustrated by the fact that I was lagging. I rotated in on Death Knight for about 10 pulls that were some of the worst pulls of the tier. I basically just did negative damage, and the whole point of playing the spec was to do more damage, so it wasn't really a great success. And in particular, I think my preparation on my alts was like good enough for heroic splits, but not good enough to be a viable alternative for mythic progression. So I had some stuff like my Death Knight had a macro that canceled breath if you hit it twice. So I would like wait for the eggs to spawn and then hit breath and then cancel breath and then do nothing. So it was not great. Just swap back over to Shaman for the rest of progression. And I didn't really have any specific jobs, just like I did one kick and kind of ran around, and that was about it. But I don't know, I was just kind of there. I will say, I think a thing that I did a little bit better that helped us on this boss was being really diligent about the most important thing on the fight, which was breaking the eggs correctly. And the way that I was diligent about this was that on every egg set, I had set a reminder to myself to look at the markers, and I would just like say them out loud to myself. And so I'd like get to a spot, I'd say like, okay, I need to find the orange marker and the star marker, because those are the ones I tend to get assigned. I'd like look at them and I'd go like, that's orange, that star, that's orange, that star, that's orange, that star. And then I could just run to that one and never miss it. I think thinking about World of Warcraft as like a muscle memory game, where the thing you're trying to do is build a habit really quickly, is quite helpful for progression in this sense. And so like, I don't know, you could say that this is like kind of a dumb or kitschy way to do something, but it was quite successful in getting me to repeat the action that I wanted really consistently. And I think this will come up on later bosses, but yeah, getting that habit down relatively quickly was pretty helpful. Kaveza, I think, was really quite a good boss for me. I just did like a ton of damage and mostly survived all the mechanics. I had, a handful of deaths. I think everybody on every guild probably has a handful of deaths. Like on one set of daggers, I hit the jump button and jumped into a line, and that was sad. But otherwise, I think I never died to daggers the rest of progression. I went to the wrong spot on one set of dashes. That's unfortunate because that's just a hard wipe. And then I had a couple sort of intermission deaths where like I was trying to play greedily with my line and like stay in the pizza slice before my line went off to, prevent other people from dying, or like just trying to, game some of the timings. And then after dying twice or 3 times there, the thing that I learned was just that like you need to get to a safe spot as soon as possible and then evaluate what you can do to help other people or like improve your situation. But the timings were such that like you could not really adjust around other positioning at first. You just like had to make sure you were safe first and then go make any changes that would like optimize your positioning. As opposed to some other things where you can like sort of concurrently optimize your positioning as you're finding a safe spot where the timings are more lenient. Like with blazes on Fyrak, I think those just like came out a little bit slower, and so you could like both find a safe spot and move your blaze line around other people a little bit for the first couple seconds, and then like plant for the last 2 seconds of the mechanic. Whereas in the intermission on Kai'Veza, like you just had to find a right spot for your regicide, and then you could worry about other people later. Silken Court, I think, was a little sad that it took me longer than I would have hoped for figuring out all the different pieces of the fight, given how scripted everything is. In particular, I think like around a couple of dispels, I was like kind of always behind the 8-ball and like being where I needed to be, and a couple times it's led to like a dispel bouncing onto me. Although I think with this boss, it's kind of hard to tell how much of that is like me being in the wrong spot versus someone dispelling early versus the person getting dispelled standing too far away from the boss. But in general, it felt like I played this boss past P1 as though it was a normal boss where you get assignments and things happen, and really like that's just not true. The boss does the same thing every time, and you should just like follow a script really, really dogmatically. Like if there's ever a boss to think about like how do I make sure I do the same thing every single time, this is exactly that boss. You should be like literally finding the exact pixel to step on every single time and like never change anything. And then the real tragedy here was that like I think after playing sort of about average for our guild for 150 pulls of Silken Court, I think our last 10 pulls I probably like hard wiped us 3 times, and so it was just like a pretty tough end to the boss, especially to a boss which we could have killed in like 110 pulls if we'd cleaned it up a little bit earlier. I don't really know if there's a consistent theme between all of those mistakes, other than that like you kind of can't really zone out when you're raiding at a relatively high level. Like you just need to be sharp and constantly think about what you're doing. And I was just like autopiloting for 20 seconds on each pull, and you autopilot for 20 seconds and you cause a wipe. And so you just like can't really do that. Queen, I don't know, we played okay. I played okay. I made some mistakes, but I think I made like a lot of the mistakes you'd expect. Didn't really like do things consistently incorrectly. I was just like some mechanics that I could have avoided messing up, or some deaths that could have been avoided had I really like sharply tried to prepare for all parts of the boss. But it wasn't, anything egregious in any direction. So the example here is like sometimes I think like one time I died to being on a platform in P2, and you get yanked into one of these like laser beams from the tank mechanic and you die. It's like, well, that's like a death that will happen on progression. But it shouldn't really happen if you think about all the ways that you're going to die ahead of time. And it's like, as someone who's preached that kind of mental preparation before, it's like, it's just kind of sad to not do that preparation judiciously and make the mistakes that it would have prevented. Like, you can quite clearly think ahead of time, like, hey, either from watching VODs or progression streams from Liquid and Instant Dollars and Echo, I can just see that like this yank happens and then the beam happens right after. So the way that I die here is I get yanked into a beam. And like, if you're careful enough about watching a kill video or something and like hitting pause every 5 seconds to figure out when you can die, you would have avoided this entirely, and I just like didn't do that. The thing that was really sick about playing this boss is that the Liquid Reminders add-on came out in the middle of it, and I do think if you're trying to raid or do any kind of hard PvE content, this is like a pretty massive tool that you should use really, really aggressively. I think most people will use it for things like their ERT note replacement. To say like, hey, hit, your health stone at this time, or, hit your, symbols of hope at this time or something. But I think even more powerful than that is like, you should just tell yourself things. On Ansrac, I had a lot of things that were like, stand to the right. If there was a mechanic where I was, too frequently to the left, just like telling myself like, hey, scoot a little bit to the right 5 seconds before the mechanic comes out. You're never going to be out of position. Things like, don't use your movement ability because you need to save it or something like that. Telling yourself like, look at this timer, or like, look where this mechanic is happening or something. Those are all really useful. In P3, I had a bad habit of dodging web blades and getting myself too far away from the AMZ that would protect us from the royal condemnations coming out. And you can set a liquid reminder that says like, okay, after these web blades happen, just say like, look for the AMZ, like get close to the AMZ. All those things, you should probably have like 20 or 30 liquid reminders on every fight, I would say. It can quite literally play the game for you and eliminate a lot of the need for like a traditional raid leader. And in the same way that like a lot of modern internet content has been defined by personalization, like you get recommended a suite of videos that are specific to your interests and your past behavior or something like that, rather than like the TV channel that plays everything for everybody. Liquid Reminders lets you personalize what your raid leader says. Like if there's a call out that you don't find useful from your raid leader, you don't have to make a reminder. But if you wish your raid leader called one mechanic out, you can just add that to your reminders and like have exactly the right stream of information at all times. It's just like unfathomably useful. Cool. So what like generically went well about raid this tier? I played every fight on prog. That's always good, especially I was our second enhancement shaman. So it's nice to play every fight as a non-raid buff DPS. It's kind of some recognition like, hey, you're actually like being brought for the player, not because your class is orange and we need one orange class. We got World 27, which is kind of a pretty banger result. I think we probably could have finished as high as like World 22 or 23 with a few less mistakes on Ansrac and Silken Court, but really not that much higher than that. Like past that, we would have had to play very different. But I think one thing that was pretty nice is that I don't think we played too much more than a lot of the guilds that finished in our sort of general region of world rankings. Like if you look at like Pop Tart Corn Dog, they were rating way more at the end of the tier than we were. We beat some US guilds like Vesper and Vision and Vodka, who all rate about the same amount, and have historically beaten our guild in the past, but we won this tier and that felt pretty nice. There are a couple of European guilds and Ethical from OC that sort of, I think, stood out this tier as being quite efficient, as like the benchmark for what you can do on a limited schedule. But this was not like in a Mirjusel where we sort of rated 20% more than everyone around us. Like no, we actually like kind of just played pretty well on a per unit of time basis. I think I generally just like continued to improve as a player in sort of all the same arenas as before from past tiers. I'd say, let's delete this and say personal survivability. One thing I think I got a little bit better at this tier, especially, was like this practice of sending the bag really, really early in progression for things like Kaiveza. Like on your first 20 pulls of Kaiveza, or pre-nerf your first 60 pulls or something, you should be out of defensives after P1 or after the first intermission. And if you're not sending like literally every button really early on, it means that you're not committing enough to learning the fight fast enough. Same thing on like pre-nerf Ansrac, where P1 damage was really hard. Like I would be overusing defensives such that I would be dead on the second rest because I had like sent everything early on, but that just made our early progression slightly more consistent, and I think it was like, correct to recognize those opportunities this tier. I think another thing that was a little bit unique to this year is that we were sort of rating at a level where there were not tons of publicly available logs or VODs. This isn't that impactful at our level because we're not sort of at that like world top 10 ranking where there's like literally no information available. But it does take a little bit more effort to like go through and watch multiple kill videos to figure out how people are using certain cooldowns or like why a guild is doing some certain kind of movement, as opposed to the like late Hall of Fame environment where you can kind of just like look at 10 different logs from people and compare them all. But in practice, it mostly just looks like you look at what Twisted did and copy exactly all of his timings. Yeah. What went poorly, we sort of talked about this. I had probably 2 bad nights, like one sort of tough night on Queen where I just like made dumb personal mistakes, and then one like really terrible night on Silken Court. And I think like had those not happened, I would have felt like I was sort of solidly above the median for our guild, whereas given those nights happened, I don't know, I felt like I was about the median level of player for our guild. And in particular, this was like maybe the first tier where I felt like, you know, where it felt like replacing every other player in the raid with a copy of me would not have been an improvement for our ranking, which is how I've sort of felt in past years, where it's like, okay, if I could play every single spec here, like I would just be better on everybody with sufficient practice. Whereas here I felt like, no, there's like other people who are really, you know, playing quite well in a way that I could not replicate, you know, on a short notice. And sort of maybe commensurate with that is that like my ults were pretty bad and were, you know, acceptable for splits, but really not ready to swap in for Mythic. And I could have just like, I think it was just a matter of spending more time doing real content on them, as opposed to like I hit some dummies for a while, but like another 5 hours of Mythic Plus on my Death Knight would have shown me a lot of the problems with how I was setting up that character with in terms of like key bindings or doing the rotation or things like that. And so I just like wasn't really ready to play Mythic on those characters. One other point of improvement, I don't know, this section could also be up here. Doesn't really matter. But I felt like in past tiers, I've sort of played focusing on my positioning and my abilities a lot more. And in this tier, I had much better awareness of what other people were doing. Whether that's like, you know, just seeing where their characters are and like how they're moving or responding to my movements, or noticing like, hey, our symbols of hope timing changed, or our time spiral changed, or like this person, you know, was caught out and like didn't get into the spirit link or something like that. It felt like I was more like playing World of Warcraft as opposed to playing my spec for the first time. Let's talk about some sort of rough beliefs about the game. We've talked about a lot of these before, but we can say not a lot of things have updated on this tier. I still think, sort of as previously stated every tier, that like it's kind of shocking to me how inefficient people are playing World of Warcraft. Almost like the average level of play should just be a lot higher, especially relative to like I have achieved relatively more success in World of Warcraft than I have in other games with a similar level of commitment, and that seems incorrect. It's not clear like why people are on average so much better at League of Legends than they are at World of Warcraft, or you know, there's just no real reason for that. And it's a game where putting a little bit of effort towards improving as a player will reap far more rewards than a lot of other competitive games. Most people just don't really seem to think about what they're doing or how to get better, and so that's a huge avenue for people who care a little bit to swoop in and climb up the ranks. This was maybe the first time ever where I felt like our group's damage was quite meaningful for our progression, where there were like some fights that were killable, or where we saved a lot of progress time because we had a little bit more damage than other groups, or slightly more optimized gearing. And in some sense, this is a small hit to my previous beliefs about this not really mattering, but in other sense, it's a pretty large update that I was somewhat right in that this shit just doesn't matter until a really, really high level. Like we were World 27, and in practice, that means we were, weeks ahead of other guilds killing the boss. And if you were someone reaching Queen Anne's at like World 60th or World 70th, you would have another 5% damage from other sources that would just nullify, any sorts of small optimizations that you can squeeze out. And so until you're at really quite a high level of gameplay where like everyone is really playing their character quite proficiently and you're preparing for the bosses appropriately and everyone's on the same page with how to play, like until then, I just don't think your damage optimization really matters all that much. But here it started to matter a little bit. Cool. So I'm stopping from, I'm sort of quitting the game, probably forever. Why is that? And what went down? So I think from about July 2022 till November of 2024, I played the game about 3,300 hours from my sort of rough estimation. I got title in one season when I pushed keys. I went from sort of no mythic rating experience or really limited mythic rating experience to getting to World 27 in about 4 tiers. The main problem here is this number. 3,300 hours is a lot of fucking time, and I'm pretty happy with how I played and the experience of getting better at this game. I sort of wanted to commit a lot of time towards one game and get really good at it, and I feel like I've done that, but now there's not a lot of future returns to be had from investing more time. I could have maybe done it in something like half the time, but it's hard to imagine doing it in a lot less than that. Like even if you're like a really, really insane player, like a JPC or someone who's like just an insane level of gamer, it probably takes you like 2 tiers or 3 tiers to hop between guild ranks and demonstrate your skill. If you're not doing 12 hours of Mythic Plus a day, and that's going to take you tens of hours a week between preparing characters and just like doing a bunch of raids. But I think I certainly could have saved some time, and some of that probably comes from things like, playing 100 hours or 200 hours on random alts each season. It just wasn't really that useful, I think, for me as a player. It just doesn't really broaden your perspective about the game that much. And if it's not done with a really deliberate intention of getting better, like pushing hard content on that character, you're kind of just doing easy stuff and going through the motions. So it's not that useful to have that experience of playing random characters. So yeah, this tier there were like only a couple US guilds above us. Like it was Liquid, Instant Dollars, XD, and Pop Tart Corn Dog that beat us. PC I think didn't actually play better than us. I think they just played more. XD definitely played more, but also probably played a little better. And then ID and Liquid obviously played way better than us. But if you look at that like scaling time requirement, for us to go from like World 27th to World 15th or World 10th or something, would probably mean like another 5 or 10 hours a week of raid progress, and more than that in terms of preparing characters for splits or more farm raids to get those characters in order for splits for the next tier, or more time spent reviewing stuff out of raid on top of an increased progression schedule. And I just don't feel like I would feel a much different sense of accomplishment going from like World 27th to World 15th with a lot more effort spent. I think I'm probably just not good enough to play at like a world top 5 level or like in an Instant Dollars type of guild. It's maybe the kind of like real stretch goal where if I wanted to commit to that and really, really practice to get a lot better and play at that level, it's a thing that I think I could do, but it would require a lot more investment. Like, I don't think I'm good enough at this very instant in time to just like join Instant Dollars and be a productive member of their raid team. It would take like some additional level of investment. I'm sort of satisfied saying like, yeah, maybe I could do that with a ton of extra investment, but it's just not really that exciting of a prospect. it's just like it's going to require a lot more raiding, a lot more sort of boring farm stuff, and won't be that more rewarding than what we did this tier. In particular, WoW is kind of a tough game in that if you have some appetite to get a lot better or achieve at a high level, you're really gated by the content release schedule, or like when other people play. And so part of that is fun in that like you get this unique experience of doing really hard stuff with other people. And so you're always going to be somewhat limited by their schedules. Like, you know, if you want to work for a company and make something awesome, you're going to have to work around the limitations of other humans. But I already spent a lot of time like working around those limitations of other people at my job or in other aspects of life. And so it would be nice to do something where the thing limiting my capacity for achievement is really my own investment in my own schedule, rather than like, you know, when we're able to raid or, you know, the time gating that Blizzard imposes on you. I think if I had one major regret from this time is that I never really took up an off role or played another character at a really high level. Like, I just played random things in like, you know, weekly 20s or 25s or whatever up to that point, or like in our split mythic raids during farm. But I never really committed to something for like, you know, I'm going to like get really good at rogue for the next 3 tiers or something, or 2 tiers. And even though I still maintain the belief that I think I could do that quite comfortably if I put the time towards it, empirically that didn't go that well this tier on pretty minimal investment. So it feels sad that I haven't really demonstrated that like multi-class capability. And maybe it would have been cool to like try something really hard on a different role. So let's talk sort of about some like broad lessons or philosophical stuff, having gone through this experience of playing this game for 3,000 hours. I should have some more questions here, but there are sort of 2 questions I like about activities or disciplines that I think people should try to answer or like have good answers for. The first of that is like, what would a Moneyball style improvement or a sort of 3-point revolution style improvement in the discipline look like? So if you don't follow sports, this is referring to like in baseball, the first application of real principle of statistical thinking in the early 2000s was coined the sort of Moneyball era, where players were sort of just being evaluated improperly for how much they contributed to the game, and this led to a large mispricing in the market for players, where you know some players were really, really quite valuable but quite cheap to pick up, and some were like quite expensive for not that much value. It's kind of like if you just didn't have a DPS meter, I don't know, people were like buying players who had AUGs on them and like not buying players who were playing really well on, you know, classes that were balanced poorly at the time or something. And then in the 3-point revolution is sort of a similar application in American or in NBA basketball, where for, you know, decades and decades, teams shot a lot of 2-point jump shots, and then people started to realize that the 3-point shot was much more efficient. Like if you make it relatively infrequently, you're still going to be outcompeting almost all the people shooting 2-point shots. And it was just sort of disregarded as like a novelty or like some silly addition to the game that wasn't really true basketball, until everyone just did the basic math and realized that it was like actually a far more efficient type of shot to take. And so now everyone shoots a ton of threes. So I think like if you're doing something, you should think about, you know, what are the kinds of practices that are sort of outdated or done for legacy reasons that aren't well supported by empirical evidence in this thing or statistical thinking. Are there things that like we will look back on in 10 years as obvious inefficiencies that should have been competed away earlier? And the second question is, this is a question from Peter Thiel, who's like a Silicon Valley guy, which is, what important truth do very few people agree with you on? Now, you don't always want to be contrarian, but it's good to be uncorrelated from the herd and sort of have your own opinions. And if you can come up with something that you really think you're doing differently from everybody else, you're sort of well on the way towards achieving different results from everybody else. So what do I think are the sort of like Moneyball style improvements that could happen in World of Warcraft? I think some of the stuff with reminders or scripting actions or really detailed planning, those are a big source of alpha. I think the reminders will continue to sort of take over the game and should have been done earlier, but maybe we're just kind of technically challenging to make. I think the latter two of like scripting more things or pre-planning more of your gameplay will probably not take real hold for a long time because it's sort of boring and it's uninteresting outside the game stuff. But things like having a real strict plan of what defensives everyone is going to hit at what time, or what sets of cooldowns you're going to use on which ads or something like that, and really like spot checking the math of like, okay, everyone will be able to live this hit if they hit this button or something. Those things will make your raid more efficient, and they're boring to do, so I think they'll continue to be mispriced. Similar thing with like recording your gameplay. I think this is just like also a really good way to improve that people won't do in mass because it's really quite boring and kind of onerous. But it's really useful. And probably a thing that more people should do is like some group reviews of their gameplay, like watch the raid do progression and think about like how we should as a group improve the way that we approach this boss. The ability to practice outside of raid. I think this is things like, can you write a program which simulates what it's like to get a mechanic on a boss in some sandbox environment? Like in the same way that CSGO players have aim training maps to practice, flick shots or something, there should be some way to practice like reacting to a mechanic on a boss fight. Or, you can take all of your players and put them in the heroic Kaiveza arena with the boss killed and like use complicated weak ores to draw mechanics on their screen and make them practice going to the right spots. Like very conceivably, a guild could have practiced the Kaiveza movement in the boss arena with a weak ore simulation during heroic week. And if someone could like bring that technology into the world, they would have saved dozens of pulls on multiple bosses. They just, unfortunately, like no one has built a clean way to do this because it seems quite hard technically and requires like skilled programming to bring to the world. But if you can make it happen, you'll probably become a lot more efficient as a guild. And I think the key insight here is that like raid time is really valuable, but a lot of raid is like spent getting people to practice individual things, and finding a way to offset or like offload that practice to people's individual time would be quite valuable. In the same way, like if you were a conductor who is, you're trying to like conduct a symphony orchestra, you would want all of your people to go, all of your musicians to like go learn a piece of music by themselves and like practice, all of their, characters or their like instrument specific quirks on their own. And then your band practice time, your like symphony practice time, is only used for synthesizing all of those lessons together and like getting the group to work together as a whole, not for like getting people to sort their individual mistakes out. It's really inefficient in WoW that like you have to combine these two things and have people learn their individual progress as well as the group progress at the same time. Another thing that I think people should do but probably will never do because it's boring is making farm more like prog. Whether this is literally shuffle everybody onto a new spec or role and have them relearn things in a sort of prog-like environment where they're sort of like unfamiliar with what their spec does. This is like a way of introducing some novelty. If you can't, make yourself be unfamiliar with the boss fights, you can make yourself unfamiliar with what your role does or like where you're supposed to stand on a new class. And so anything that gets you to learn a little bit about the game is going to be useful because otherwise you're playing farm and you're not learning anything. You're like decaying. The other way I think you can accomplish this is make people take off gear, or just like drop 2 people from every farm raid. if you just play every raid like down a healer and down 2 DPS, people are going to learn how to play around tight progression like timings better and better, and it won't be fun because you're going to wipe and it'll be hard, but you might actually like get better at the game, which is going to be useful. Becoming more efficient with sort of non-boss raid time. I think this is not so much a Moneyball revolution as it is like maybe a room for a 10 or 20% improvement that isn't really being captured right now. But things like almost every guild probably re-clears too much. People should re-clear a lot less later in the tier. Almost every guild is doing too much Mythic Plus by the end of the tier. They should cut down on their Mythic Plus time and like add a raid night. Almost every guild stops extending or starts extending too late. Almost every guild does things like putting down a feast before a pull, or like sending long pull timers when you should send really short pull timers and like cut down on your time in between pulls as much as possible. And then also Velocity is a guild that did really well this tier, underpulled every boss, played really, really sick. Probably people should take lessons from how they approach the tier, but I don't know the specific things that they did differently. Cool. What are some broad lessons from time spent playing World of Warcraft? First, writing things down is good. I'm actually quite happy that I have this YouTube channel as an archive of like arguments that I've had or thought experiments I've come up with, or interesting hypotheticals or things like that. Because I can see like, hey, these were things I were thinking about at the time. These were arguments I was coming up with. These were the kind of problems that I thought were interesting. It would be a little bit more sad if I just like spent 3,000 hours playing the game and didn't have anything to show for it. But now I can say like, look, here's an archive of like places where I've disagreed with people and thought about the world in a unique way. I'm happy that I've done that. Another lesson. If you want to achieve different results from everybody else in anything, you probably have to do things differently than them. Another way to say this is that like average levels of effort, or sort of like median levels of effort, will get you the median result. If you just show up to raid twice a week and like play your class the same way as everybody else and like don't think about how you can do anything differently, you will sort of get that result. If you want to climb a bunch of ranks in the raiding scene or something, you need to think about like, what do the people at the level I want to play at do? How do I copy them and sort of replicate their performance? You can't just like do the same things as everybody at your current level of gameplay and expect to somehow outperform them. You really have to be doing something different in order to achieve a different result. World of Warcraft is a pretty nice case for this kind of study in that there's nothing inherently preventing you from doing the things that the best players do. Like you can open a log of someone on, Honestly, which is, a top OCE guild, and literally look at all of the globals that they do, and your class will be able to hit the same exact globals because you're probably basically just the same spec with about the same gear. And, modulo things like, power infusion, if you hit all the same buttons in the same order, you will achieve the same result as them. It's just a matter of like getting to bridge that gap where you're hitting the same buttons as them and like standing in the same place and playing with the same consistency. But in other fields, it's like really hard to observe what top people are doing. And so you sort of have to guess at like how to copy them. Whereas here you can just like really, really directly observe like what they're doing differently than you and adjust your behavior in response. And that's a really, really powerful mechanism. Another set of paired claims. It's good to have beliefs and state them concretely and test them or think about the evidence that would prove this belief right or wrong. And similarly, if you're going to make a claim about the world, it's nice to think about the quantitative lower and upper bounds surrounding that belief. So if you think something like it is worth spending time to farm an augment rune in season 3 of Dragonflight, you should go through the math and say like, how many pulls is this thing actually saving us? Like, what is the net change on our progression from having this item versus not having this item? What are other things we could be doing with this time? What are the, what is the actual amount of time we're investing in order to get the augment rune? if you know those things, you can make better decisions about the world because you've like spent a little bit of time thinking about the problem quantitatively. Um, if you sit down and do the math and you say like, should we spend more time between polls discussing strategy, or like should we, spend time between polls to rebuff everybody, or does it matter how efficiently we pull trash in between bosses? Like maybe you can go down and like do some scratch work and say like, look, we kill, I can pull up some logs and see that like it took us this long to kill each boss, but it took us this long to get from boss to boss, and so the trash is like, maybe it's 15% of your time, and it's actually worth a lot of raid progression hours to get your guild a lot more efficient at killing trash quickly. Or maybe you do that math and it's like, trash took up 3% of your time, and there's no way to really kill it that much faster, and so, you're fine to not think about, ways to improve that speed. But you're only able to make those claims and like make those decisions once you've come up with some quantitative, estimates of how valuable some decision is. So being able to like come up with these really rough heuristics of like, okay, this effect should be worth, 5% of progression hours, or this effect should be worth 20% of our progression hours. That's really quite useful for prioritization. Another pair of sort of two thought experiments that I think are quite useful is to think about like, if I'm going to do something, what would it look like to take it very seriously? Like, if you cared a lot about getting good at World of Warcraft, what kinds of things would you do? Like, would you, would a really serious player like just queue up into random, plus 10s every week and just do them over and over? Or would they be doing something different? Would they be like reviewing logs? Would they be reviewing their own gameplay footage? Would they be practicing other classes? Would they be like talking to other people who play the game? Like, what sorts of skills and habits do effective people have? And are those worth implementing for myself? That's a great question to ask yourself. The other thing that I think has come out of progression raids is, what would it feel like if this action I'm currently doing felt really easy? Or how would it feel to be really good at this thing? I noticed this a lot on Queen Ansarek, where it was quite a hard boss, but you had this sense from doing other hard bosses in the past that they feel qualitatively very differently when you're at the end of progression versus the start. And one thing I had remembered from Fyrak is that at the start of progression, I was looking at the wrong spots on my monitor. Like on Fyrak, when the Dark Flame frontals come out with his shadow clones or whatever, the thing you want to do is like stop and look at all of where those frontals are pointing and then find the safe spot in the room. You explicitly like want to flick your eyes away from your character and like identify 4 different lines and then like find the intersection of those lines. And on Queen Ansarek, a similar thing that you want to do when like web blades come out is look at a few different spots on the ground and then identify the safe spot from there. And once you start thinking in terms of like, what does the eye movement look like for someone who's really good at this thing or who has like a lot of practice on this boss, then you can just replicate that early on in progression and sort of skip some of the natural steps of happening, or like the unconscious improvement. When you try and make that explicit and say like, what would it look like to be really far progressed on this boss? Like, what things would we be doing differently? How do I be moving my character differently? You can just like think about those things and then implement them real quickly, instead of having to just pull the boss over and over and over and sort of like hope that that repetition somehow drills that behavior into you sort of subconsciously. At the same time, I sort of think I got better at the game in part because I played it a ton. And so to that end, playing the game a ton, or just like doing something over and over unthinkingly, is still a pretty good method for improvement. It's just maybe not optimal. But there's something to be said for like doing things inefficiently and doing them egregiously to get better at them. Last thing I like is that I really like making analogies or trying to compare different systems or different ideas or schools of thought to one another, because it lets you draw conclusions from unrelated places. Like when you think about playing World of Warcraft as being very similar to an American football team, or a symphony orchestra practicing a new piece of music, you can start to think about like in what ways are these two things similar? In what way are these two things different? Why should they be different? Why should they be similar? Is there anything we can take from these other disciplines that applies to this current thing, or does it not apply at all? I think that's just a really useful method of thinking. Like, I think I was listening to a Gabe Newell lecture, the founder of Valve. He's talking about how he was working on a CNC machine, like a steel mill thing. And it turns out that if you do all the same problems in CNC milling, you're basically just doing computer graphics, because you're thinking about, angles of incidence, or like how to point something at another thing, or, rotating an object in 3D space. And then once you have a lot of experience doing 3D graphics from, making Counter-Strike and Half-Life, it's really easy to apply those same lessons to milling and CNC control. And the same thing applies to World of Warcraft, where like if you can draw on other disciplines to inform your current behavior, you're just like so much more set up to come up with novel ideas or novel insights, rather than being sort of locked in the perspective of someone who only plays World of Warcraft and really only knows that discipline. What's next for me? I don't know. I might play a bunch of Go. That kind of sounds kind of cool. We'll see how far that extension goes. Otherwise, it's probably looking like I read a lot of books, or a lot of textbooks or articles or something like that, and then I maybe spend a lot of time biking. But those are the current things I'm most interested in. Probably not going to play very much World of Warcraft for the foreseeable future. Anyway, thanks for sticking around. Thanks for listening to me ramble about World of Warcraft for the last year and a half, 2 years.